1944. The air inside the hangar was thick with the smell of oil, steel, and something unspoken. Fear, maybe. 4 German engineers stood around the American P-47 Thunderbolt engine, its shell partly cracked open like a beast wounded in battle. The war had turned brutal. Every piece of enemy technology they captured now felt like a message written in metal. And this engine, found mostly intact from a downed fighter, was something they couldn't ignore. Marcus, the lead engineer, wiped his greasy hands on his gray uniform and leaned in. "It's not like anything we've built," he muttered, staring at the complex network of pipes, valves, and heat shielding. His 3 assistants nodded quietly. These were men used to precision, used to knowing the inside of every German machine like the back of their hands. But this was something else entirely. The outer housing was heavier than expected. Bolts lined the engine like armor, tight, oversecured. It wasn't made to be just powerful. It was made to survive. They began unbolting it slowly and carefully. Every new layer they opened revealed more secrets. There were cooling systems that ran deeper than necessary, redundant oil lines, fireproof mesh tucked inside, even blast padding between sections. Each of these additions told them one thing: the Americans were building their planes to keep flying no matter what. "It's like they don't care if the plane gets hit," said Rolf, the youngest of the group. "They just wanted to keep flying long enough to finish the job." Marcus nodded. He wasn't afraid to admit it. It scared him. The Thunderbolt had always been called a beast in the air. But now, standing over its heart, they realized it wasn't just a nickname. This thing was overbuilt, overpowered, and unforgiving. A war machine in the truest sense. They reached the data plate on the inside, stamped in clear block letters. P-47D 28RE, serial 4228315. Pratt & Whitney R2800 59 mass. Production 50-683. Units as of June 1944, 15,000. The number hit the room like a slap. 15,000? Rolf said again, as if the number would change if he said it slower. "They've built 15,000 of these monsters." Marcus didn't answer. He just stared at the plate. His mind was already calculating. That many planes meant a sky they couldn't touch. It meant every German pilot was outnumbered, outpowered, outlasted. It meant that this engine in front of them wasn't special. It wasn't a rare glimpse into American genius. It was average, standard, mass-produced. He looked around at the others, who were still frozen. Then he stepped back from the engine, suddenly feeling cold. "We're not winning this war," he said quietly. "Not against this." Silence fell over the hangar. The other engineers didn't argue. They didn't need to. The truth was sitting right there in front of them, wrapped in steel and rivets, whispering its brutal promise. The Americans hadn't built a better machine. They had built an army of them. The wind outside howled softly against the steel walls of the hangar, but inside, the silence felt heavier than the massive P-47 engine itself. Marcus paced slowly, his boots echoing with each step on the concrete floor. None of them had spoken for minutes. Rolf still stared at the engine like it had personally insulted him. Klaus and Dieter stood by the tool table, pretending to clean their hands, but they were just trying to process what they'd seen. 15,000 engines, 15,000 flying machines, and that was just this model. God knew how many others the Americans were building, while Germany struggled to keep its factories from being bombed to dust. Marcus finally broke the silence. "Strip the housing off completely. I want to see the compressor and turbine." Klaus gave a short nod, and the men returned to work, though something had shifted in their movements. Before they were dissecting a trophy. Now it felt like they were performing an autopsy on the future. As they worked deeper into the engine, they found something that stopped them again. The turbo supercharger system, a massive overbuilt component packed with power. It was unlike anything they'd ever fitted in a Luftwaffe aircraft. While Germany had begun experimenting with superchargers, they were still limited by resources and complicated design flaws. But this was efficient, brutal but efficient. "Look at this," Klaus murmured, pointing to the twin intercoolers. "This is designed for altitude, to deliver full power at over 25,000 feet. Our fighters choke above 20. Marcus nodded slowly. They're not just winning in numbers. They're winning in the sky we can't even reach. Rolf slammed a wrench on the table, hard enough to make them all flinch. Then what the hell are we doing here? Taking notes while our country burns? Dieter, who had been quiet the whole time, looked up from behind his clipboard. Maybe that's all that's left. Learning why we lost. Marcus said nothing because deep down he agreed. This war, this dream of German supremacy, it wasn't just slipping, it was collapsing. But something still nagged him, something deeper than just the shock of mass production or engineering genius. It was the intent behind the design. The way the Americans had built this machine felt different. German engineering had always prided itself on precision, elegance, balance. But the P-47's engine was a sledgehammer, not a scalpel. It was built for one thing, endurance. It was made to get hit, keep flying, drop its bombs, and make it back home. Why would they build like this? Marcus finally asked aloud, mostly to himself. This kind of power, this kind of weight. It's not a fighter in the classic sense. It's a tank with wings. Klaus scratched his chin. Maybe they weren't building to match us. Maybe they were building to outlast us. Dieter added, the Thunderbolt wasn't built for acrobatics. It was built to escort bombers, to strike deep, to make sure we can't sleep at night. Rolf walked back over to the engine and ran a hand along its massive intake. We mock them, call them sloppy, slow, clumsy. But while we were perfecting our toys, they were building monsters. A sudden loud noise, boots on concrete, made them all turn. A Luftwaffe officer had entered the hangar, flanked by 2 guards. His coat was crisp, his face hard. He didn't look at the engine. He looked only at Marcus. You're done here, he said flatly. Orders from above. The engine is to be transported to Berlin immediately. Marcus frowned. We haven't finished the analysis. You've seen enough, the officer replied. More than enough. This is now classified. As the guards moved toward the engine, Rolf muttered under his breath, or maybe they don't want anyone else to see how hopeless it really is. Marcus didn't argue. He stepped back. Let them take it. What else was there to learn? The P-47 wasn't a secret weapon. It was a symbol, a warning written in steel and fire. The officer gave one last glance to Marcus before turning away. History will not remember this engine, he said. Only who won the war. Marcus watched as the machine was rolled away, the hangar doors opening with a loud grind. Cold air rushed in, cutting through the warmth of oil and metal. And for the first time since the war began, he felt truly, deeply unsure of everything. The engine was gone, but the sound of it, 15,000 strong, was still roaring in his head. Outside the hangar, a grey truck waited with its engine humming low, like it already knew what it was carrying wasn't just another piece of scrap from a fallen enemy. The P-47 engine, now crated and chained, was lifted by a thick iron crane onto the back of the truck. The German soldiers escorting it kept their eyes low, their expressions tight. None of them said a word. They all felt it. Something about that machine was heavier than just its steel. Marcus and his team stood just beyond the doors, watching it disappear into the misty morning. The wind carried a cold bite now. Winter was on its way, in more ways than one. Did you see the officer's face? Rolf muttered as the truck disappeared down the road. He was scared. That wasn't orders. That was panic. Marcus didn't respond. He was staring at the empty space the engine had left behind, like he could still see its shape in the air. He wasn't thinking about the officer or even the war at that moment. He was thinking about what came next. That night, Marcus sat alone in his quarters, reading through his notes under the yellow glow of a desk lamp. Diagrams, sketches, part labels, and measurements. It was all there. Every detail he could copy before the engine was taken. The turbocharger system, the reinforced crankcase, the oil cooling circuits, and the production number. 15683, he kept circling it over and over. Not because he didn't believe it, but because he couldn't accept what it truly meant. 15,000 engines like that. 15,000 aircraft that could shrug off damage, outclimb German fighters, and stay in the air long enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. He flipped the page and stared at one last sketch, a side profile of the engine, labeled and marked in his own handwriting. At the top corner, he had scribbled something without even thinking about it earlier that day. Victory isn't brilliance, it's repetition. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. That was it. That was the truth. The engine had screamed at him louder than any speech or radio broadcast. The Americans weren't trying to outsmart the Germans. They were trying to outlast them, outbuild them, overwhelm them. Across the hall, Klaus knocked gently and stepped inside. He looked tired too. "They're moving us," he said. "Orders just came down. We're being transferred to the engine plant in Dresden. We'll be working on prototype interceptors." Marcus gave a short, humorless laugh. "Prototypes? Of course," Klaus sat down across from him. "They think one miracle design will turn the war around." "We've been chasing miracles for 2 years," Marcus replied. "Meanwhile, they're just building machines." Klaus lowered his voice. "You think we can even match it? What we saw in that engine?" Marcus shook his head. "No, not without time, not without resources, and not with the Reich collapsing on every front." Klaus looked away, silent. Then Marcus leaned in. "But maybe we don't need to match it. Maybe we just need to learn from it. Not for this war, for what comes after." Klaus raised an eyebrow. "After? If this war is lost," Marcus said slowly, "someone will need to rebuild. Someone will need to know what worked and what didn't. That engine, it's not just a weapon. It's a blueprint for the kind of thinking that wins wars. Practical, relentless, scalable." Klaus was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "So we keep the notes." "We keep everything," Marcus replied. "Even if they burn the rest." The door creaked open again and Rolf peeked in. "They're saying Allied bombers hit another factory in Essen. Flattened it. Hundreds dead." Marcus closed the notebook slowly and stood up. "Then we'd better get some rest. Dresden will be no safer." As they left the room together, Marcus took one last look at the sketch on his desk. The engine that changed his entire perspective. They had mocked the Americans, called them crude, unrefined, careless with engineering. But now he knew the truth. They weren't careless. They were prepared. And that was the most dangerous kind of enemy. One who didn't just come to fight. He came with 15,000 more behind him. Dresden, January 1945. The train pulled into the industrial district just before dawn, its whistle barely louder than the groaning of war in the distance. Marcus stepped off onto the frozen platform, suitcase in one hand, the other clutching his long coat against the wind. Klaus and Rolf followed close behind, both quiet. The once proud city now smelled of ash and fatigue. Factories stood like broken teeth across the skyline, many operational, others gutted by air raids. They were assigned to a facility labeled Flugmotorenwerk 17, hidden beneath camouflage netting and false rooftops. Outside it looked like a normal textile warehouse. Inside it was something far different, an emergency development center for the Reich's last gamble, jet propulsion. The roar of a test engine echoed through the corridor as they entered. Technicians in white coats darted between machines. Engineers hunched over drafting tables with bloodshot eyes. The air was heavy with desperation disguised as innovation. A colonel greeted them at the entrance, his face drawn and eyes sharp. "You're the ones who examined the P-47 engine," he said bluntly. "Not a question." Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." "Good. You're working on the Jumo 004 and the Heinkel 162 if it survives another prototype test." Klaus blinked. "You're putting a jet engine in a wooden fighter?" The colonel gave a bitter smile. "Yes, because wood doesn't get bombed before it arrives." There was no further discussion. They were handed blueprints, security badges, and told that meals were once a day. Unless they were missed, then they were none. This wasn't research. This was survival masked as engineering. That night, Marcus unpacked his suitcase and opened the leather-bound notebook, the one containing every sketch, measurement and technical assumption from the P-47 engine they had examined weeks ago. He had kept it hidden, wrapped in cloth between his clothes, knowing full well if the Gestapo found it, it could cost him his life. But now, inside the cold, concrete walls of Dresden's hidden factory, it felt more like a lifeline than a liability. As they settled into their assigned lab, Rolf whispered what they were all thinking. "We're not here to win. We're here to delay losing. Marcus didn't argue. Then let's delay it smartly. They began examining the UMO-004, the heart of the Reich's desperate hope for jet superiority. On paper, it was revolutionary. A turbojet that could push a fighter past 800 kilometers per hour. Fast enough to outrun the Allies. Deadly if it worked. But in reality, the engine was fragile. The blades cracked. The turbines overheated. Every third flight ended with catastrophic failure. Germany didn't have the alloys, the time, or the logistics to perfect it. Meanwhile, the Americans were shipping entire squadrons across the Atlantic, fully fueled and armed. Klaus compared one of the turbine blades to a sketch from Marcus's notebook. They overthought this, he said. The Americans would have made it heavier, stronger, and cared less if it added 20 kilos. Marcus nodded. Exactly. They build for battle. We build for the lab. By the second week, word reached them. The Allies were advancing faster. The Russians from the east, the Americans from the west. Cities were falling in days. Orders came down, ramp up production of the Heinkel 162, no matter the risks. Even children were being trained to fly them. Marcus had seen enough. He met with Klaus and Rolf in the break room late at night, well after curfew. The factory was silent except for the distant hum of the generator. I'm copying the entire Jumo design, he said. I'm placing it next to our notes on the P-47. We're building a record. For what? Rolf asked. So some Allied engineer can laugh at how far behind we were? No, Marcus replied. So someone can learn from it. So this doesn't happen again. Not like this. Klaus leaned back in his chair. You think we're going to survive Dresden? Marcus didn't answer. None of them did. Because deep down, they all knew the truth. The war was closing in from all sides. But their enemy wasn't just tanks and planes anymore. It was time. And it was winning. But even if they couldn't stop what was coming, they could make sure the story wasn't lost. Because buried in these engines, both theirs and the Americans', was the real truth of the war. Not who had the brightest scientists, but who built for the long fight. And right now, the sky was filled with the roar of those who did. February 13th, 1945, Dresden. The sirens wailed just after 9 p.m., cutting through the cold night like a scream from the heavens. Marcus was in the lab, pencil in hand, working on a composite sketch comparing the P-47's oil cooling system to the Jumo 004's flawed bearings. He didn't even look up at first. Sirens were common now. Sometimes they came with bombers. Sometimes they didn't. But tonight felt different. Footsteps thundered down the hallway. A young officer burst into the lab, face pale. Rossref bombers inbound. Hundreds of them. Move! Marcus dropped his pencil and grabbed his notebook without thinking. Klaus was already on his feet, Rolf stuffing documents into his coat. None of them spoke. There was no time. No questions. No hesitation. The Allies had come. They raced down the corridor, past engineers screaming, past technicians trying to cover equipment with tarps. Outside, the distant rumble of engines filled the sky, low, constant, endless. The air smelled strange, heavy, like something was about to break. As they reached the bunker entrance, Marcus turned and looked back at the lab one last time. It was just a room now, a coffin for blueprints. They couldn't save the factory. But maybe, just maybe, they could save the knowledge. Inside the concrete bunker, dozens of people huddled. Men, women, even teenagers in factory uniforms. Someone slammed the steel door shut just as the first explosion rocked the ground. Dust rained from the ceiling. People screamed. The lights flickered. Then came the second blast. Then the third. And then it stopped being countable. The world above them erupted in fire. Marcus crouched near the back wall, arms around his satchel, pressing it to his chest like it was a child. The sound wasn't just bombs. It was buildings collapsing. It was screams echoing through the pipes. It was the end of something. The heat crept in through the ventilation shafts, not from flame, but from burning air. Dresden was a city of stone and steel, and now it was being melted. Hours passed. The bombing came in waves. People in the bunker cried, prayed, fainted. Rolf vomited twice. Klaus sat silently, blood dried on his forehead from where a beam had struck him during the sprint. When the shaking finally stopped, silence returned. But it wasn't peace. It was hollow, like the world had nothing left to say. They emerged from the bunker just before dawn. Dresden was gone. Not damaged, gone. What had once been a city of architecture and ambition was now an ocean of fire and ash. Buildings flattened. Roads cracked open. Trees burning like matchsticks. Bodies, some still whole, some just gone. Marcus stood in the middle of the street, unable to breathe, not because of the smoke, but because of what he saw. The factory was gone. Their lab was a crater. The rail lines twisted like dying snakes. Even the chimneys had fallen. And yet, his notebook was still in his hands. The sketches, the comparisons, the quiet warnings built into those engine diagrams. Klaus joined him in the street, coughing hard. "Everything's finished." "No," Marcus said, voice hoarse. "Not yet." He pulled Rolf and Klaus aside and led them down what remained of a side alley. They found a basement that hadn't collapsed, a cold, dark space with only broken crates and one rusted oil lamp. There, Marcus opened the notebook and tore out the final pages. With a trembling hand, he began scribbling a title on the front page. Technik der Zukunft, the engines that ended an era. "The Allies will occupy us soon," he said. "When they come, they'll take everything. But if they find this, maybe someone will read it. Maybe someone will understand it." Rolf stared at the notebook like it was a relic. "You really think anyone will care what 3 engineers thought as their world burned?" Marcus looked out the shattered basement window, where the orange glow of the dying city flickered against the dawn. "I think history always starts with someone who paid attention." They wrapped the notebook in cloth, sealed it in a tin, and buried it beneath a loose stone in the floor. No fanfare, no farewell, just an act of quiet defiance. Above them, Dresden smoked and bled, but below in the dark, the truth waited. Not about victory, not about power, but about what kind of world rises from the ashes. When all the engines go silent, 3 days later, American boots touched Dresden soil. The once proud German city, charred beyond recognition, surrendered not with a fight, but with silence. No troops remained to hold ground, no orders to defend. Just ashes, twisted steel, and the wandering eyes of survivors who no longer believed in flags. Among the first Allied reconnaissance squads was Lieutenant Daniel Price, a 26-year-old American airman turned ground officer. He'd flown escort for bombers over Germany in a P-51 Mustang, a cleaner, faster cousin to the Thunderbolt, and had seen cities from above turn into smoke beneath him. But Dresden was different. From the ground, the destruction was intimate, personal. As he stepped over rubble and past bodies charred beyond identity, he couldn't help but ask himself the same question over and over. What had they built here that cost this much to destroy? His answer came in the form of rumors passed between units. Hidden engine plant, prototype jets, something big. A squad of engineers from the U.S. Army Air Forces arrived days later to investigate. Among them was Chief Technical Officer Robert "Bob" Ellis, a grizzled mechanic from Detroit who had worked on early Thunderbolt engines before they were shipped overseas. His orders were simple: recover anything German that could help America stay ahead. Engines, weapons, documents, anything. When Bob entered what was left of Flugmotorenwerk 17, he found only ruins. The blast had turned the entire research wing into a pit. The foundations were cracked. Machine frames were melted to slag. But Bob had learned a thing or two about German stubbornness. If there had been engineers here, they'd have left something behind. And he was right. It was one of Bob's techs, a fresh recruit named Levy, who found it first. Inside, the collapsed remains of a basement storage room under a dislodged stone tile. Levy's boot struck metal. They pried it loose and found a rusted oil tin, sealed and wrapped in thick cloth. Inside, a leather-bound notebook, pages slightly scorched around the edges, but legible. On the front page, written in precise German, Technik der Zukunft, the engines that ended an era. Bob's eyebrows rose. He flipped the first few pages, his eyes scanning the sketches and annotations. He recognized it instantly. It wasn't German engineering, it was theirs. The P-47 engine, drawn in obsessive detail down to every bolt and line. Not just copied, but understood. Side-by-side comparisons with German jet designs. Notes in the margins, warnings, observations, even respect. This wasn't just spying, Bob muttered. This was studying. The last page was in a different tone. A letter handwritten in German, translated aloud slowly by a nearby interpreter. To whoever finds this, we did not build these machines, but we studied them, because they showed us something. Not how to win a war, but how wars are truly won. Through endurance, through pragmatism, through the choice to build what works, not what impresses. We were told to chase miracles. We learned too late that what we needed was consistency. If this book survives, may it be a guide, not for more war, but for building a world where we never again confuse genius with arrogance. Bob closed the book and exhaled slowly. Around him, soldiers continued sifting through wreckage, searching for parts, for trophies. But he knew already this was the real find. Not some secret weapon, not a wonder engine, but understanding. Back at headquarters, the notebook was flown to London, then to Washington. Military intelligence stamped it strategic value high. Portions were translated, studied, filed. Engineers at Pratt & Whitney reviewed the German notes with curiosity, and in some cases, unease. One report simply read, "They learned what mattered." Too late, but they learned. As for Marcus, Klaus, and Rolf, no names were found. No identities matched. No one knew if they had survived the firebombing or vanished like so many others in the chaos. But the notebook survived. And in the quiet rooms where post-war technology was being shaped, in the offices of future jet designers, space program engineers, and Cold War tacticians, those sketches appeared again, referenced, admired, even whispered about. Not as enemy intelligence, but as a strange, tragic tribute. Proof that even in the collapse of empire and the ruins of arrogance, someone had paid attention. Someone had watched the future pass by inside a steel engine casing and decided to record its lessons before the flames came. Because in the end, it wasn't the loudest weapons that echoed through history. It was the quietest truths. Spring 1946, Washington, D.C. Inside a quiet wing of the Pentagon, far from the noise of generals and politics, the notebook from Dresden sat on a long oak table. Around it gathered a small group of engineers, analysts, and one man with a sharp jawline and unreadable eyes, Dr. Ernest Caldwell, director of a post-war military technology program with roots so deep. Not even all his staff knew who he truly reported to. The room smelled of pipe smoke, old documents, and ambition. Dr. Caldwell turned a page carefully with gloved hands. The sketches were old now, smeared with soot and time, but the meaning was alive. "These Germans," he said finally, his voice like dry gravel, "were on the verge of a realization we only stumbled into by accident." One of the younger engineers, Walt Reynolds, leaned forward. "You mean about the P-47 designs?" "No," Caldwell replied. "About how to think about war machines." He tapped the page with a knuckle. "They were chasing elegance. We chased output. They were building miracles. We were building tools. But at some point, their brightest minds started to see it. This," he held up the notebook, "is the moment Germany stopped thinking like an empire and started thinking like survivors." The room was quiet. No one challenged him. Because he was right. The American war machine had crushed its enemies, not just with innovation, but with volume. With standardization, with the boring, brutal strength of factories that never slept. But inside that ruined German notebook was something sobering, a mirror, one that showed not just how close Germany came to engineering brilliance, but how easily it could happen again, in any country, under any flag. If enough people forgot what war had truly cost, Dr. Caldwell closed the book. "This isn't just a relic, it's a warning. One day, someone else will try what they did. Someone else will believe they can outwit the world with genius and fire. And when they do, we better remember what stopped them. Not brilliance," he looked around the table, "but scale." They decided to keep the notebook classified. Filed under Project Archive number 2177, it was buried in a drawer of the War Department's engineering records, accessible only to a few. Caldwell made sure a copy went to the newly forming Air Force R&D Division, and another to a young agency that hadn't even gotten a name yet. What would later become the CIA. Outside the room, the world was already shifting again. The Soviet Union had emerged not as an ally, but as a threat. Former Nazi scientists were being split like cards between the Americans and the Russians. Paperclip, ulsos, secrets for rockets, secrets for jets. And yet in the middle of it all, that single notebook remained untouched by politics. Because it didn't contain a bomb, or a jet, or a hidden formula. It contained perspective. Meanwhile, in what was left of East Germany, under Soviet control, Marcus survived. He had escaped Dresden's firestorm with Klaus, walking for days through ruined villages, their faces black with soot, their hands blistered and raw. Rolf hadn't made it out of the bunker. He'd stayed behind, coughing too hard to walk. They never saw him again. Marcus never rebuilt planes after the war. The Soviets didn't care about what he knew, they only cared what he could produce. He worked as a translator, then a railway technician. Every night, he stared at the ceiling of his small flat and wondered whether that notebook had been found, whether anyone had read what they tried to say. Klaus, who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite during the escape, never spoke about the war again. He married, raised pigs on a small farm, and died quietly in 1962. Marcus lived longer, long enough to hear about American jets breaking the sound barrier. Long enough to hear whispers of Soviet MiGs being built with help from German engineers. Long enough to see the world race toward another kind of war, cold, quiet, and just as dangerous. He never told anyone his full story. But sometimes, late at night, he would sit with a cup of tea and write letters he never mailed. Letters addressed not to people, but to machines. The P-47, the Jumo 004, the Heinkel. He wrote to them like old friends, because they were the only ones who had truly listened. And somewhere, deep beneath the weight of history and ash, he believed those engines still whispered back. Whispered that they had seen everything, and remembered autumn 1952, Dayton, Ohio, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. In a climate-controlled archive beneath Hangar 5, the Dresden notebook sat quietly behind reinforced glass, labeled only as Artifact No. 2177A. Few ever saw it, fewer still understood its importance. But one man did. Major Thomas "Tom" Ellison, a sharp-eyed test pilot turned intelligence liaison, had heard rumors of the notebook since his early days in military R&D. Some called it a footnote of the war. Others, like his mentor, called it the book that scared the Germans into silence. He had just returned from a classified debrief in Berlin, where he toured Soviet MiG wreckage recovered from the Korean front. What he saw rattled him. The MiG-15 jet, sleek, fast, and dangerously agile, had German bones. He recognized elements from the Jumo 04, even hints of the same compressor structures from the notes in the Dresden sketches. The Russians hadn't just scavenged German scientists after the war. They had read the same damn book. Tom requested access. 3 weeks later, after enough paperwork to bury a battleship, he was granted 1 hour with Artifact WW2 The archive was cold, sterile. The notebook was smaller than he imagined, worn, fragile, but its contents still razor-sharp. He turned the pages slowly, reverently. Diagrams of the P-47 engine. Side notes in neat German script, breakdowns of materials, cooling systems, tolerances, fail-safes. And then, midway through, a series of emotional, almost confessional paragraphs. Observations not just about what was built, but why it mattered. Tom flipped to the final page. He didn't speak much German, but he recognized the name signed at the bottom. M. He wondered who M had been. A Luftwaffe engineer? A deserter? A man stuck between his country's collapse and a dawning world he couldn't quite enter. Tom wasn't just a pilot. He was a student of machines, of what they meant. And this notebook, he realized, wasn't about engineering superiority. It was about ideological surrender. These Germans hadn't been conquered by firebombs or invasion. They had been defeated by something more humbling: mass production, durability, and the simple will to do what works. Tom snapped a photo of the last page before closing the glass case. He knew he was bending rules, but some things were worth remembering personally. 2 weeks later, he was called to a roundtable meeting at the Pentagon. Representatives from the newly formed ARPA, Advanced Research Projects Agency, had questions. They were analyzing Cold War advancements in aviation. The Soviets had launched new interceptors. America needed a better understanding of what they were really up against. And then someone, a quiet advisor from RAND, dropped a name during the meeting. "Have we reviewed the Dresden sketches again?" Tom sat up straight. They had. The notebook was back in play. Behind closed doors, analysts began revisiting it, not just as a war relic, but as a map. The Germans, in their final days, had not been chasing glory. They were chasing efficiency. That notebook outlined early glimpses of modular engineering, material optimization, even aerodynamic theories that wouldn't become mainstream until years later. A Cold War arms race wasn't just about warheads and speed. It was about who could build smarter. And the strange irony: the blueprint for surviving the next war might have been written by the losing side of the last one. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in a small East Berlin apartment, Marcus sat quietly on a wooden bench, now gray-haired, bones aching in the cold. He lived a simple life, on ration books, old newspapers, and memories he didn't share. He hadn't spoken of the war in years. No one around him knew he'd ever touched an aircraft, much less helped dissect one of the most feared engines of the 20th century. But he remembered. He always remembered. Sometimes in the evenings, he turned on his battered radio and listened to Western broadcasts, illegal, forbidden, crackling through the static. One night, he caught a report from America. A mention of jet performance, an unnamed artifact used for post-war analysis, a remarkable engineering document of unknown origin. He smiled faintly. They'd found it. He had no way to prove it, no way to tell the world what he'd buried in that cold Dresden basement. But in his heart he knew. Somewhere his words had reached the right hands, not to glorify, not to win, but to warn. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there had finally learned what he and his friends had discovered too late: that wars aren't won by genius. They're won by the quiet men who see the future in steel and choose to write it down before the world burns again.